Thank you very much for your attendance for the second day of our Public Diplomacy Forum between NATO and Georgia. We are very honored today to present to you distinguished panelists and correspondents from Moscow, from Georgia, and also from Ukraine. And thank you very much for participation. And we'll have an excellent moderator, Mark Lighty, Director of Strategic Communications at SHAPE. And I'm sure we will hear more concrete stories, down-to-earth stories, more concrete examples of the era of post-truth that we are bouncing into in our daily lives. So the floor is yours. Mr. Lighty, please moderate the session.
No, thank you very much. And good morning to everybody. And I think we're going to have a good start to the day. So without further ado, let me very briefly introduce our three panelists. To my immediate left is Anna Nemtsova. She is currently the Moscow correspondent for the Daily Beast and Newsweek. Previous experience includes writing for organizations like Politico, BBC, Foreign Policy. She's extensive experience on the front line, a 2015 recipient of the Courage in Journalism Award. To her left is Natalia Anteleva. She is co-founder and editor-in-chief of Coda Story. Prior to that, she worked for the BBC in many parts of the former Soviet Union. She's had Emmy nominations for her investigations into human rights and the stories she wrote linked to those, and a Georgian as well. And then on the far left, we have Alexei Makukin. Alexei is one of the people who started up or was an early worker for the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which was a critical component in getting Ukraine through its crisis after Euromaidan and the Russian annexations. He now works, he's done work for the Ministry of Defense. He co-authored their Stratcom for their armed forces and is now director of the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group. So this is an excellent group of people. They're each going to have their 10 minutes or less, he says, hopefully. And then we will go into questions. So we're going to take it from left to right. So Anna, please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the organizers for giving me a chance to be here with you in Tbilisi, the city I dearly love. Thank you for your attention. In August 2008, I was here in Georgia covering the war and also trying to evacuate the bodies of Alexander Klimchuk and Giga Chikladze, two reporters killed, trying to cover both sides of the front line. They were true believers in the independent journalism. 8 years later, we saw colleagues die in Ukraine. On May 24, 2014, two journalists, Andy Rocelli and Andrei Mironov, were killed in crossfire in Andreevka. They tried to cover both sides of the front line. And we rarely find out the truth about which bullets, whose bullets kill our colleagues. So about 20 years ago, when I first started working as a reporter in the region, I cared about human rights stories. I still think it is important to be a witness and to hear people's voices. I will tell you how I started covering Russia and its neighboring states. In December 1999, I bought my own ticket to Nazrani, capital of Ingushetia, where people escaped from Chechnya, from their destroyed cities. And we were dozens of reporters who believed there in Chechnya that we should be witnesses. We should see things with our own eyes. Chechen War was the first conflict that I witnessed. It was a very clear understanding for both the military and the locals that we reporters were playing an important role as witnesses. Most of my friends, independent reporters, field reporters, still believe that. But the most inspired of us are being stopped. Our colleague and friend, a well-known journalist, Pavel Sheremet, was bombed in his car right in the center of Kiev. Our Russian colleagues, Anna Politkovskaya, Nastya Baburova, Natasha Istimirova, were killed in daylight in their cities. We still don't know who ordered their murders. Leaders of this region, even progressive ones, share a common feature. They are easily offended. Men in power, with all the authority given to them, feel vulnerable under the pressure of harsh criticism by civil society, by the press. Criticism is taken as a personal betrayal. Once leaders run out of patience, they begin to ban the critics and stop pretending that they are not dictators. Today, the truth is not about fact-checking and balances, but about defense and attacks. Western media is being portrayed as an attacker. President Putin says that Russia is under attack by media. This year, Russia was ranked as 148th country by Reporters Without Borders. In Russia, authorities often condemn reporters who are criticizing the government for having a foreign agenda. In the 90s and early 2000s, when we started covering the region, foreign correspondents were seen as heroes, investigating news, pushing for reforms, bringing truth to people. Nobody thought that we were too pro-Russian or too pro-Western. But there is a big change now. Authorities often see a reporter not as a storyteller who carries a narrative of current events, but as an information soldier, a warrior, either defending the motherland or attacking it. Today, foreign freelance reporters cannot get accreditations with Foreign Ministry of Russia. Online publications cannot be accredited at all. So a big percent of foreign reporters who would like to work in Russia cannot. A few who tried have been deported. Many of us reporters covering news for Western publications are seen as too pro-Western propaganda. Kyiv authorities do not allow many Russian state media reporters to work in Ukraine. Both Western and Ukrainian reporters are criticized for covering the other side of the front line in Donetsk region. Ukraine is placed as 101st country on the index by Reporters Without Borders, while Georgia's index is 61. Ura! Not only reporters are seen as soldiers, not only they are seen as soldiers, they feel as soldiers. Once I was covering a story for the Chronicle of Higher Education in Moscow. At the Moscow State University, a student tells me, I would like to become a defender of my motherland. So when reporters feel themselves as defender of motherland, many issues stay uncovered. As reporters coming to work in Chechnya, we are aware of physical risk, but the idea that we might endanger our characters is what really pushes us out of the region, and this particular issue worries me a lot. As a freelancer today, I still make my own choices when and where I go. No editors send me places, as unfortunately many in Russia think. Conflict correspondents risking their lives in the Middle East and Africa, Ukraine and other violent places know what they are going into. As a big tragedy to lose friends and colleagues to gunfire in conflict zones, it is an even bigger tragedy and shame to see them shot in peaceful cities. I still believe that we go to the field to tell true stories, getting beyond the cliché and not as soldiers of the information war. Using this opportunity, I would like to address Georgian authorities. Protect your reporters, even if they dig out the truth that discredits you. They are witnesses of your rule. They are storytellers of your time.
Thank you very much. So, with that, thank you very much. Natalia, perhaps you could add to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Very inspiring, and there is a lot that I agree with, and I've slightly moved from, unfortunately, to an extent, from being in the field and being a reporter to kind of thinking for the past 2 years about media as an industry in general. I've moved from being a reporter to running a media startup. Fake news and disinformation, which is the topic today, has been very much on my mind as the editor-in-chief of Coda Story, because Coda was set up, we started publishing 2 years ago. And basically the whole idea behind Coda is that we take one big crisis at a time. We put a team of reporters on it, and we follow that crisis for an extended period of time, doing multimedia reporting on all sorts of aspects of it. And what we're trying to achieve is really fill that gap that mainstream media often leaves, where it lacks continuity when it tries to tackle continuity and context, and when it tries to tackle big issues. For the last year and a half, the topic that we've been tackling has been disinformation and fake news. And very helpfully, as I took a taxi here this morning, my taxi driver told me, very helpfully for the purposes of this panel, of course, my taxi driver told me that apparently the Georgian government has done a deal with the German government in the last 2 weeks that will allow the Georgians to keep the visa-free regime with Schengen, but in exchange, Georgia will have to accept 100,000 Syrian refugees who will be resettled to Georgia. So, in case any of you have not heard that news, I tried to question my taxi driver and find out, where exactly he got the information. He said he read it online. I figured that there was no point in trying to. I did tell him that's probably not true, and you should probably know a little bit about what the source is rather than I read it on Facebook. But I think it's a brilliant illustration of the challenges that we face as a society, and for purposes of my profession as a media industry who is now competing not just with fellow media organizations but also with countless outlets that are driven either by agendas of hostile governments or very often by commercial interests who are spreading alternative realities. I have been fascinated by how this alternative, what are effectively lies, but what we have, a fancy word called alternative facts. There is no such thing really as alternative facts. It's either a fact or it's not. But what's really important, and I think where the media is still trying to figure out how to handle it, is we as journalists, I think, have a responsibility of capturing how the fake news, what is a real crisis of disinformation is actually affecting the reality we live in. For me, there is absolutely no better example than Ukraine. I've covered the war in Ukraine for, up until about a year ago when I stopped going. And from the very beginning, I, along with all of my colleagues, and I don't know whether Anna will agree, I know she was there as well, I think there was a great deal of failure on the part. I'm not talking here about the Russian media or state media, which isn't media, and I don't consider it journalism at all. And I'm not talking about Ukrainian media, and many Ukrainian journalists have done an absolutely amazing job, but at the end of the day, it was caught up in the war, and it was an assault on their country. But I'm talking about the Western media. And I think there are a lot of lessons that the Western media can learn from what it didn't do right in Ukraine. And one of the things that we didn't do right, and I count myself among those people, is that we ignored for a very long time the fact that we were covering the events on the ground, and we were covering what the politicians were saying and the kind of the war of wars that was going on. But what we're not looking at was that parallel reality that was unfolding and how it was affecting the lives. For a very long time, BBC, when you are a war reporter for the BBC, and as any big media organization sends you on these hostile environment courses, you run around the woods and sort of rural England and get kidnapped and are taught how to walk through a minefield. And for a long time, the war in Ukraine very much felt like that. It felt like a fake war where life went on as normal, but there were these outbursts of fighting, the outbursts of hostilities. But then if you turned on the Russian state TV, they were showing pictures of bombed out buildings. And we journalists were all seeing that. We were not asking how is that affecting the reality on the ground. What we got as a result was a passenger plane in the fields of Ukraine with 289 people dead, among many children, and more than 10,000 people who have died since. And I really think there is absolutely no better example of the damage and the danger that disinformation and fake news poses than Ukraine. I think the second lesson of Ukraine is the fact that how important it is for journalists to go back to the very basics of reporting, because we've been, and this is where sort of the difference between the digital and traditional media comes into play. A great example of that was the annexation of Crimea. And I remember well standing in Crimea in front of the Ukrainian military bases that were surrounded by the Russian troops, and we knew these people were Russian, even though they didn't have any insignia. But then Putin would come out and say, of course, no, 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 they're not Russian. And we reported that they were Russian, and we also reported that he was saying they were not Russian. And involuntarily, it was amazing to see how much we helped the Kremlin narrative to spin and to become a possibility in the minds of so many millions of people who started basically wondering whether what was true and what wasn't. And that is something that as journalists we can no longer afford to do. And there is a very easy solution to not allowing this to happen, and the solution is to get away from reporting what politicians say and start reporting more what politicians do. And sort of 10 minutes is definitely not enough to go into the details of what media as an industry needs to do to achieve that. But it's more important than ever today to start looking to do more on-the-ground reporting and to move away from Twitter feeds and to move away from basically the words of the politicians and to move to covering what actually happens. Because otherwise we end up covering noise. What no journalist did in Crimea, what would have made a difference and what happened later on in the conflict in Ukraine was track down that one Russian soldier that didn't have the insignia and put a name and a story to his face. I don't think I'm mistaken. We didn't hear a single story of Sasha from Krasnoyarsk and how he got there. And that is kind of reporting that requires more time, it requires more effort, it requires more money. It's harder to do than standing there and saying, he said that and she said that. But that is also the kind of reporting that the world needs today, I believe, more than it has done in a really long time. Because otherwise, we will be getting taxi drivers who are, will be telling you, will be convinced in something that, isn't really happening. I do have a small video to show you, which is more, how are we doing on time? Do you have a few more minutes?
Fairly tight, but we'll be okay.
We're out of time. Okay, I won't show you the video, but if basically our the attempt, what we are trying to do with at CODA with fake news and disinformation is very much covered as what it is, as a real crisis that is not some abstract thing, but it's something that is affecting our lives, it is affecting our societies, and if nothing is done about it, we will be, as a society, to an extent we are already, but we will definitely be paying a price for it. My message to journalists, and I think the big lesson of the last few years is that we need to, start covering fake news as a crisis. It is when we cover things like pollution, for example, we don't say, oh, the Minister of Health said pollution levels are fine, but this person said that pollution levels are terrible. We actually go and find that family that had to move, or because of the, they can no longer live in the place where they lived, or we find a child with irreparable lung damage. And that's what we need to be doing as a media industry about disinformation.
Okay. Thank you very much. And to say to your point that after the conflict, people like Vice, Bellingcat, they did find the names, but of course the damage was done by then, and that's the point you're making about timeliness. We do have the names now, but long after the damage of Putin's lies were done. Now, we've been focusing very much on Ukraine. We have a Ukrainian, and you were at Storm Center through that and afterwards. So please, over to you, Alex.
Thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Georgia. So it was said a lot about role of Russia in informational warfare. and of course Russia is the leading and the most proactive actor in this sphere. My organization, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, have done a lot to counter Russian informational aggression in Ukraine. But we also believe that it is important to study what Russia is doing to their domestic audience. And so now I would like to share some of results from the research we have done together with the Estonian Center of Eastern Partnership. So if you look attentively at Russia military documents, you can find out that their definition of informational operations is different from the West. According to their definition, informational operations is constantly ongoing activities, while in the West it is defined as activities only during hostilities with specific countries. We know a lot about fakes and troll factories and so on, but we suggest to analyze narratives as a more profound layer of their disinformation. One example, so this is an example of fake news. It was complete fake, supported by screenshot from mobile video game, though it was posted on official Twitter of Russian Ministry of Defense. It was debunked in the next couple of hours by many agencies. Still, that didn't change opinion of an average Russian viewer. Why? We believe because there are a deeper layer of narratives. And here's another example. So an event which had nothing to do with Russia, but you can see how it was commented by different actors in Russia, because they have this narrative that Russia is great and that the West is trying but failing to compete with Russia. Now I would like to show you a video just to give you better understanding of how Russian news looks like.
Единственное, чем могут выделиться эти люди из Прибалтийской республики, это нападками на Советский Союз и на Российскую Федерацию. Под этой ширмой постоянные угрозы, что их собираются захватить и оккупировать, они пользуются поддержкой, простите, Запада.
Появились свидетельства, что в Германии мигранты начали насиловать несовершеннолетних детей, а граждане страны говорят о безнаказанности и вседозволенности для преступников.
Потому что никаких европейских ценностей нету.
Мы же видим, что, в общем-то, Евросоюз сам по себе разваливается.
Итоги года подводит и Европа, которая, если еще и не потрескивает, то по швам уже трещит. Брексит, правый поворот, раскалывающие всех мигранты. Европейский лидер Германии в политическом параличе.
По официальным данным, в 2011 году Югендамт Германии изъял из традиционных семей и передал однополым 38 500 детей.
Например, в Соединенных Штатах Америки, в Канаде, в Англии, в странах Евросоюза практика сжигания сердец геев просто-напросто повседневна.
129 малышей за неполные 3 года. Норвегия и Финляндия продолжают воровать наших детей.
Подобные случаи происходят в благополучных скандинавских странах с пугающей регулярностью. Только за минувший месяц об изъятии детей заявили 3 российские семьи.
По финским законам детей могут забрать без предупреждения и разбирательств. Сначала в детский дом, позже к приемным родителям. Суд и следствие для этого не нужны.
О праве на частную жизнь не вспоминают, когда приходят забирать ребенка из семьи. А то, что называют изъятием ребенка, выглядит порой как спецоперация.
Вчера пришло кому-то, писали 14 человек отбирать детей. Можете себе представить?
В центре Стокгольма женщина-полицейский задержала мужчину из-за того, что мышцы молодого человека, по ее мнению, были неестественно большими.
Но интерес часто вызывают совсем другие символы. То женская блузка от известного бренда с, на первый взгляд, незаметными нацистскими зигами.
Новая бедность во Франции – явление, к которому трудно привыкнуть.
Чтобы чем-то кормить детей, флорист повыкручивала в квартире лампочки.
В Германии быть неонацистом становится модно. В целом создается впечатление, что еще немного, и Европа начнет вести себя так, как будто на дворе 1938 год, ночь разбитых витрин в гитлеровской Германии.
Впрочем, здесь и ежегодные шествия ветеранов латышского легиона СС никого не удивляют. Их дети и внуки, похоже, учили какую-то другую историю, в которой убийцы стали героями.
В попытках вытереть ноги о собственную историю Польша соревнуется с Прибалтикой. Послы Эстонии, Латвии и Литвы возмутились недавней публикацией во французской «Le Monde», где их страны были названы бывшими советскими республиками и потребовали больше себя так никогда не называть.
В Латвии фашистов уже на законодательном уровне возводят в ранг героев.
По словам президента Эстонии Керсти Кальюлайт, резервная армия должна быть способна к мобилизации в считанные часы и дни.
Самолет МиГ-29 будет в Эстонии через 5 минут. Псковская бригада ВДВ через час. Не смешите нас своей мобилизацией.
Сейчас Польша называет себя главной жертвой Второй мировой. Но не она ли была ее хищным инициатором? Но просчиталась. Уже в наше время поляки крушат памятники советским воинам. Нападают на российских футбольных болельщиков. Не пускают в Европу через свою территорию российских байкеров и клянчат деньги. А ведь если прикинуть, еще должны оставаться.
Исторический путь Европы завершился пиком Европы объединения под нацистским флагом, когда они получили по харе русским сапогом.
Дания оказалась в центре международного зоосекс-туризма.
В причинах могущества педофильского лобби разбирался наш корреспондент Иван Благой.
В 1984 году Ассоциация геев, транссексуалов и педофилов официально вошла в один из комитетов фракции «Зеленых» в Бундестаге, то есть могла оказывать прямое влияние на политический курс партии и работу парламента.
В Европе потихоньку, почти незаметно, но все же началось обсуждение разработки закона о легализации инцеста. А в Норвегии и в Исландии инцест фактически уже легализован. Теперь же некоторые политики Европы, в первую очередь Скандинавии, открыто называют инцест гендерной нормой. Причем по аналогу гомофобии предлагают ввести такое понятие, как инцестофобия, за которую будут наказывать. Главные борцы за идею – неолибералы и активисты гей-движения. Многие депутаты местных парламентов, продвигающие свою идею всеми возможными способами.
Почему зоофилы со всей Европы хлынули в Данию, и долго ли это будет продолжаться?
То никогда Россия на коленях стоять не будут. Вот эти к нам еще приползут на коленях и будут просить наших новых технологий, наших космических программ, и мы еще будем кормить Европу и Америку.
Это похороны Евросоюза, это реквием по Евросоюзу.
Давайте
уж точно это реквием по традиционным ценностям в Европе.
Страны Прибалтики уже заявили, что они-то останутся в Евросоюзе.
Ну
то есть будет от Калининграда до
Кому не
Пскова.
нужны, это мусор. Мусор.
Как же нас достали эти НАТО и ЕС? Пусть себе засунут свой технический прогресс.
Sorry for that.
Scandinavians were so evil.
So I have 2 minutes more. I will do very quickly. What we did, we have analyzed top 3 channels, all newscasts and all political shows for 3.5 years. In total, it gave us almost 23,000 of negative mentions, negative news of Europe on these 3 channels. And based on that information, here are some conclusions. So first, let's look at how their media landscape it looks like. We have analyzed the first 3 channels, Russia 1, Channel 1, and TV. They are all under complete Kremlin control, of course, either directly or through Putin's very close proxies. It's interesting to know that information from outside Russia has very small chances to be heard in Russia, because only 5% speak any foreign language, only 6% prefer to get information from foreign sources, and only 7% of Russians traveled abroad of what is called former USSR. So the first fact, it's very massive. You can compare the amount of negative news only on these 3 top channels. It is 18 times per day, which is 3 times more than, for example, Coca-Cola had on same channels. If we look at top 10 countries, so mainly countries with the biggest population in EU gets the biggest share of negative news. This one is very important. So if we compare ratio of positive news to negative, we can see that the average ratio is 85% for negative. So one could probably say that maybe it's the way how news operate, or it's just the way how Russians see the world, very, very doom. But we see that some countries are portrayed in a different way. There are only 2 countries, according to Russian media, where life is much positive. It is Switzerland and Belarus. And I think the reasons are quite obvious. We have identified that there are 6 main basic narratives among all this negative news. I will very briefly describe them. So the first one, horrors of life. It's about saying that life in Europe is very unstable, insecure, and difficult. Just daily life is very difficult. Decaying Europe is about saying that Europe is not really united and it is falling apart because there are no common values and because there is erosion of moral values. Protests, it is about that protests are constant in Europe, especially in France, and that protests are not a sign of democracy, but a sign of a weak state. Terrorism, it is much exaggerated. Usually even small crime events are covered as terrorism. Refugee crisis is the narrative that it's Europe's fault that they supported the US in their attack on Syria. That's why they have refugees now, but they failed them. And sanctions is the narrative that Russia is not affected by European sanctions. Actually, it's good for them because it's make their spirit stronger. Example of one narrative, I will give only one example for the first one, horrors of life. So authorities in this narrative are usually depicted as incapable of managing challenges. Interesting that in the end, they even create a story that this unstable life in Europe on daily basis because Europe deserves it. So even nature disasters, according to Russian media, there are plenty of nature disasters in Europe. So they prompt their viewer to think that even nature punish Europe by disasters. Skip this. One quote as an example. Yeah. So this event probably really happened. The question is whether it's worth to be on 2 channels in Russia, 2 top channels in prime time with similar wording. Okay, I'll probably skip already this and jump to conclusions. So France is top in 3 narratives in protests, in horror of lives and terrorism. Germany is mainly associated with sanctions and refugee crisis. We can see that total amount of negative news has increased significantly by 87% from 2014 till the end of 2017. What is Russia's Kremlin's reply to it? It's actually 2 words: anti-Russia hysteria and Russophobia. So they deny everything and make their counter-accusations. Why do we think it's important to study it and to analyze it? Because there are some threats emerging from it. They convince their population not to accept liberal European values, and even more, they convince their population that they have right to be aggressive from toxic European values. And they also dehumanize an average European, so making for convincing their domestic audience to support any decision, any aggressive decision which could be made by Kremlin. And unfortunately, we in Ukraine witnessed it in full manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we can agree we've had some fascinating interventions there. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'd like people to put up their hands so I can kind of get them. Taking your point, and one thing's there, do you think that part of the problem that we're now facing is that the Russians have learned to play us? You mentioned in a minute that any Russian denial always gets reported and then muddies the water. So do you think that they understand how we're playing, and they're using our commitment to fairness or neutrality against us, and as a result are able to get their narratives out? And if people could put their hands up while you're...
Is it so?
Yeah, please.
I can start answering this question. So I reported a series of stories for the Daily Beast about the Kremlin's agents. Last year I was traveling to Baltic countries, to Germany, to Balkans, to ask the Kremlin's agents, Russia Today, Sputnik people, what they actually, what their message is about Russia. And it turned out that many of them were, first of all, citizens of the countries where they lived. In Baltics, it would be Latvian Sputnik reporters who knew so little about the actual things in Russia. They had no idea what Bolotna protests were about. They had no idea what happens to opposition. So the agents, the actual soldiers of that information war, very often ignorant about what is actually happening in Russia. And when you ask them direct questions, they just tell you how bad things are in Europe, and they have very little to say about what Russia is and what Russian message is today in the world. So they're arrogant.
Natalia, I think, did you?
You know, I think when you say, do you think they figured out what our game is? And by our, I think you mean what the West's game is, right? I don't think
playing the rules.
Yes, I don't think. Well, first of all, in terms of sort of, there is no question that Russia has used and abused the whole, you know, the fundamental values of democracy, including freedom of expression. There's obviously no question about that, and Russia continues to benefit. And of course, the debate is rife on whether to ban or not. And you know, my personal opinion is that you should never ban, but because that will backfire. So they have, I think one fundamental in the discussions of like what should we be doing about it, what I would really like to see, and I'm not really seeing it, is I think it's massively important, the work that you have done. I think it's the most comprehensive kind of presentation of the narratives of Russian state media narratives I've ever seen, and we've been covering a lot of that in a less sort of, you know, data scientific manner. But while this is like, it's hugely important for the West to understand what is being said on the Russian TV, because what's being said on the Russian TV is reflected by what most people think. And I think the second thing is that I think there's a real need to be less reactive. I mean, personally, I'm slightly, there's this fashion for fact-checking now, which I don't understand, because I think fact-checking is just part of journalism and has always been, and you know, we should always be checking facts. But this whole myth-busting and what are they called, the debunking, you know, I'm not sure, all of that is very reactive. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the response to the Russian propaganda, because a lot of it is being done in reaction to that, as, you know, just sort of cover, you know, there's this real sense of being defensive.
Okay, question over here, I know, and looking for any other questions. Okay, if the next microphone could go to the gentleman there, please.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel, and thanks to Alexei for this reality check presentation, because it really brings, some things forward which are very important. And just to go in line with the thought that Natalia just put on the table, is that debunking is not an ultimate answer to countering propaganda. Because you gave a very good example about this video game trick, which was debunked in several hours, but yet still it did not really have a significant influence on the audience. So my question is then, through what have you learned through your experience? What are the most effective means? And sometimes when in countries like Ukraine and Georgia, the strategic communication system does not work that much, then the NGO, the civil society and journalist associations have to do their own part. So through your experience, what are the lessons learned? What works most, and what you have done that really bear the result that you can recommend? Thank you.
Thank you. Alexei, please.
Yeah. So there is no just one thing you can do to solve this problem. It's a total war in informational realm. So probably the most important, the first thing, you need to be aware that you are under informational attack, because until you are not aware, it is the most effective. And we had that period for a long time in Ukraine. Then we were not really aware that these channels are pro-Russian channels, these media are pro-Russian media, and that we are under attack. Second thing, you of course need to have your own positive narrative, because you cannot just say no, you cannot just debunk, you need to have your positive story. But still, you also on daily basis, and that's what we did when we were in Ministry of Defense, you on daily basis also need to debunk fake stories and to give floor to your speakers.
Can I,
briefly?
I have a very short video that sort of answers your question. I think for journalists, I think the most important thing when dealing with this is to try to cut through the noise and sort of create something that's, that's sort of positive, that is not reactive, as I said. So could you show the video? It's very short, and it's an example of a story. It's sort of self-explanatory. So an example of
satisfaction. Push me, and then just hurt me, till I can get my satisfaction. Satisfaction.
Мне очень нравится момент, когда Наталья из туалета выходит. Это здорово.
Push me, and then just hurt me, till I can get my satisfaction.
Вообще молодцы. Все молодцы. Молодцы. Ну и как мы Их тут же как мимо пройти. Я понимаю, что нужно нам тоже сделать именно пенсионерский клип на эту тему.
Сегодня, кстати, опубликовали, посмотрела, зашла новость, что только 1% пенсионеров может рассчитывать прожить на свою пенсию. То есть мы все должны еще и до смерти пахать.
Или сидеть на шее у детей, которые сами, так сказать. Не, ну на самом деле, вот ужас какой-то.
Вообще это все смех сквозь слезы, по большому счету. А есть абсолютно какие-то идиоты, вот так угорали. Лучше бы руки помыла после
Поменяли бы унитаз и плиту, мне понравилось. Ну приди поменяй, стены покрась. Ой, какой дурачок.
То есть коммуналка, где двум людям не разойтись, это нормально, да? У нас полстраны так живет.
Не, мы должны специально для съемочной группы унитазы менять и плиты. Что они хотят? Может нам вообще поменять еще и страну? Так и клип тогда не нужен будет вообще.
Идиота похабка.
Дурачье.
Как вы думаете, возможно ли с помощью подобных протестов что-то изменить?
Мне кажется, да.
Значит, вот...
Потому что когда... Дело в том, что ведь мы чего хотели? Понятно, что мы там никого не хотели там возбудить своими жирными телесами, это понятное дело, да? Какая разница, что мальчишки делают в свободное время? Каким образом это отражается на их профессиональных качествах? Что они вообще продемонстрировали в этом клипе, да? Прекрасное чувство юмора, креативность, то есть, наоборот, мне кажется, те качества, которые любому человеку в любой профессии могут пригодиться. И вдруг какой-то ажиотаж, какие-то комиссии, отчисления, ну бред сумасшедший. И у меня, я не могу, то есть все время страну в какую-то пучину идиотизма. А как бороться с этим идиотизмом? Ну пусть такими средствами, ну хоть как-то.
I think the pensioners deserve a round of applause.
I covered Ukraine crisis for the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and Newsweek, and the Daily Beast. So for Al Jazeera, I reported a story about people living next to gas pipes in Donbass. And in Slaviansk, already after Ukrainian army took over Slaviansk, I asked people next to destroyed building how it all started. Do you remember how the conflict started? And they had difficult time remembering what it all began from, and they said, we had protests against shell gas. You remember the Slansovy gas, shell gas fields. Ukraine, under this new authorities, were going to sell shell gas to Americans. And we would have blown up here, you know. Pushilin was telling us that the whole Donbass would just blow up if we produce shell gas. So that's when Ukraine, when that information was spreading around, at that very moment when people were getting brainwashed, somebody had to come and tell them what the actual truth was about the shell gas, but nobody did. So that's where we're losing.
Okay, we've got one question already, please. And then if there's any others, we'll probably get one more in.
Thank you very much, Georgi Molodiny, Strategic Communication Center, Georgia. Thank you, organizers, for providing very useful platform for consensus building on very complicated issues, and thank you, panelists, for very interesting speeches. As a former journalist, I would like to ask questions to my colleagues. Can we say that journalism is in a crisis because of propaganda and hybrid threats? Thank you.
Please,
I wouldn't say that journalism is in crisis. I believe in strong storytelling. And I was very happy yesterday to hear from a few presenters on different panels that we shouldn't be cynical. We should not fight propaganda with propaganda. So I'm a strong believer in independent truth, independent journalism. We just need to get off the chair, go back to the field, and cover the story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think journalism is actually in a better place. It has been in a really long time. I think there is a real kind of revival of the importance of it, and many people are, suddenly realize that, oh yeah, that thing, it can't just be done by bloggers and people who call themselves journalists. There is actually a reason for being, for the industry and the profession. I think the society is in crisis because of fake news and disinformation, and I think, media is part of it, and it's something that media has to cover and figure out how to deal with. But, and I couldn't agree more with Anna. I think the most important thing that we can do is go back to some of the basics, go back to the field, tell stories of real people, and not the noise that's happening on Twitter and social media.
Can I put to you one thing which we haven't covered, which is philosophically, the Russians seem to be systematically saying there's no such thing as objectivity, which, if you like, is the intellectual and philosophical base for post-truth and fake news. I mean, do you see this, and I think this could equally be to you, that objectivity as a concept needs to be defended?
Yes, I even had it in my presentation. Kiselyov, who is not only the famous host, but also head of one of state news agencies in Russia, he declares it openly. He says that the time for objective journalism has gone. Yeah. This is his statement. He says that, and it's all the same, he says, you wouldn't find objective journalism on CNN, BBC, and so we are doing the same. You always have opinion. So this is their official position. It's important to understand that Russia doesn't have ideology, and this is the difference from the USSR. They're not suggesting anything. Their purpose is just to distract. Their purpose is to distract everything Western, because then they have opportunity for them.
You're a journalist. Do you see what I mean? I see these quotes from, for instance, the head of Russia Today. She states very clearly that there's no such thing as objectivity, only as many different points of view as possible.
I mean, where I'm almost reluctant to get into sort of via you and an argument with the Russian, with Margarita Simonyan or the Russian, any representative of Russian state television, because in the eyes of the Kremlin, there is no truth either, and that is just not true. You know, there is truth, and you know, for centuries and centuries, the basic role of journalism has been to figure out what that truth is and present it to the best of our ability within the framework that has been developed that allows us to be as objective as fair as we can possibly be. So
that's a very Western view. I mean, you're saying that's what
no, but
journalism
it's not.
always
It's a universal view that there is truth and there are lies. And yes, I subscribe to that view, because I think, you know, there are soldiers in Crimea who are Russian, even though someone says that they aren't, but they are Russian, and that's the truth. That's the fact. You know, there is no arguing about it.
But there is an argument. I mean, sorry to press you, there is an argument because the Russians are arguing. When you say there isn't an argument, there is an argument, because if there wasn't an argument, the Russians wouldn't be doing really rather well.
In that case, Russians are lying. Russians are lying and are saying that, right, which is why I say, well, we shouldn't be covering the lies. We should be, you know, providing the evidence of what's really happening, and we shouldn't be engaging in a discussion over are they Russian or are they not Russian. We need to figure out whether they are not, and not engage in a discussion over basic facts.
Well, as somebody who is based in Moscow, I can tell you what's going on with the media. There are two faculties educating journalists. One, at the Moscow State University, the old school Faculty of Journalism. They have photographs of hero journalists on the walls, and they're from Novaya Gazeta. They're portraits of reporters killed on the field. There is also that other faculty that is educating broadcasters for state television. And that's where, as I mentioned in my presentation, I met a student who said, I'm somebody who is going to defend my motherland. Mm-hmm. So they think of themselves as of soldiers, and this is a completely different philosophy. So Russians are arguing among themselves about the philosophy of truth and of how to report the story.
Okay, I have one last question there, and then I think we'll have to wrap up because there isn't a break to cushion the time, so please.
Alina Frolova, Ukraine. So I just want to support and to give some ideas, because I think that maybe that's not the crisis of the journalism, but that's the challenge for the journalism. I think that the last event shows that we're all saying about that the governments are not capable fighting, but probably governments shouldn't be. So the civil society activation, this is the key, which saved in some way Ukraine and Georgia, and probably this is the way. But what's happening with journalists? What I've heard from Anna, that should be 2 points of view. And I'm not agree with this. Because
I didn't say
when
should be 2 points
you said that we should report both sides. Okay. I'm more on the position with Natalia, that if you understand that the second side is just lie, you're spreading the lie. And this is what most of journalists in the beginning were doing. They were saying, okay, there are some people, there are some soldiers, non-identified. They understood that this is Russians, but they didn't say it. So the time for journalists changed. The challenges for journalists changed. And it should be some other way of doing journalist work, because this is crucially important for today. And that's what I just would like to hear your opinion, and I'm fully supporting Natalia in her position that it should be, if this is lie, it should be said that this is lie, even if this is the second opinion, so-called second opinion.
I'm sorry, what is your name?
Alina.
Alina, I wrote a Newsweek story from Donbass, from the eastern region of Ukraine, about Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And it was one of the first stories that came out. It was the cover of the magazine about Russian soldiers fighting in Donbass. If I were not on the ground, if I were not on that side of the front line, I would have never reported the story. The only point that I tried to make is that a reporter should be covering both sides of the conflict. Otherwise, he would never find the truth. The war. The war. It's the war. Yes, you're right. It is the war. But the reporter should be on the ground.
Okay. You know, I actually don't think that Anna and I are in disagreement. I think we agree. And I think there is a difference. My main point is that I think we need to move away from, as I said, sort of covering what people are saying and trying to go deeper into what's actually happening. And, you know, I think it's hugely important, for example, to spend time and to understand, you know, people who are so-called agents of Russian influence or whatever you call them. That Anna had an example of the story she did in Latvia of, like, reporters of Sputnik. We spent a long time recently talking to Americans and Brits who tune into RT, trying to understand what is it that makes them want to watch. I think it's our job to try to understand the other side, because if we don't, and there is, you know, what we can no longer afford to do is get locked up into these echo chambers of the recycled statements and information that just generates more noise, in which sort of the truth, if you will, is lost, and we end up with the confusion and the taxi drivers who just feed me complete nonsense and, like, believe it to the end. And I think this is not just specific to the region. I think this is a global problem at the moment. And I think the White House Correspondents' Dinner, that this whole controversy around it, is a really great example as well. I mean, as much as it pains to say it, like, you know, I think Trump has a point of not joining in this, like, annual kind of access, like, celebrity fest. And I think journalists need to you know, peel themselves off away from the establishment and the access, and go, you know, do more on the ground stuff, because I think we're losing touch with our own societies, and unless we somehow reconnect and understand and are able to explain better to our audience what's happening in our communities, in our societies, we're gonna you know, the societies will continue to disintegrate.
Okay. I fully agree with my colleagues, and I just want to point out that this is a vulnerability that Russians are using, this approach that you need to show both sides. So if a journalist is sure to the best of her knowledge that this is lie, he should say it. Let's exaggerate and imagine you have Hitler's opinion and Jewish opinion, yes? You cannot compare them and say that the truth is somewhere in between. No, to the best of your knowledge, you should say that what he is doing, that this is lie, what are the consequences.
Thank you very much. I think it's an extremely good point to finish on. So perhaps thank you very much for your questions, and if we could thank our audience and thank our
dear guests, we will have a technical break for 2 minutes, but please stay in the room. It will be just changing the panelists. And I also hope that you are actively using our hashtag NGPD Forum 2018. Please be active in Twitter and on Facebook, and let's make ourselves heard and out vocal on social platforms as well. Thank you.